thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to be able to put on this series today. It is really something that we have been doing since the pandemic started, but our topics have changed and are relevant to the times and to what our faculty are thinking about, and we hope therefore relevant to you too. So this one is by our very own Dr. Rellie Derfler Rozin, and she has titled her session today, The Pitfalls of a Zero-Sum Mindset. Already intriguing. We are pleased to host you, and we are again working together with our Office of Alumni Relations to power this series. We would especially like to thank and welcome our Smith and University of Maryland alumni, our current students, and friends of the university community who have joined us today from across the world. And we hope this finds you well and appreciate your time and engagement today before we even get going. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rellie Derfler Rozin. She is an associate professor of management and organization at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. She received her PhD in organizational behavior from the London Business School, a master's of science in industrial psychology from Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, and a bachelor's degree in psychology and economics from Tel Aviv University. Rellie studies how social context impacts employee decision-making and examines situations in which people in organizational settings behave in ways that end up counter to their own goals. As such, she applies psychological theories to critical organizational challenges. For example, how organizations should design their selection practices or structure employees' jobs to seek solutions that improve employees' lives in the workplace and the organization's success at the same time. She uses a multi-method approach, as our faculty are wont to do, combining field surveys, field experiments, laboratory experiments, and archival data analysis. And most of her research revolves around two specific themes and areas: behavioral ethics and selection decisions and biases. Before Dr. Derfler Rozin begins, I want to ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute during our time where she is speaking to reduce and mute the background noise. We will be presenting her material for about 35 or so minutes today, and then we will move into a Q&A function there where you are please posting your questions in the chat area as much as you'd like to throughout, and we'll keep track of that and then respond during that Q&A section. Be ready for a few polls as well, and please post your questions again in the chat area. Rellie, I'm going to kick it back over to you. Thank you for joining us, and you have it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you, Chris and Alison and the whole team for making this happen. And this is a really great initiative and opportunities, and I'm honored to be here today. So I am going to present three different research projects that I've been engaged in recently that are from different domains, but kind of have this, what I call, and I constructed this talk around this zero-sum mindset, and that is in many cases detrimental, and kind of we'll talk about this, and this zero-sum either or winner-loser mindset. And before I start, I do want to acknowledge my collaborators, both here in the US and across the globe that have been very helpful, and we've been having great insights together working through this journey, and those are collaborators across those different projects. And I want to start, please, if I may, with a poll question. So the scenario appears here on the slide, and I'm going to also launch the poll, the question itself. But imagine that you're interviewing a promising candidate for a job, and she seems enthusiastic about the work. Towards the end of the interview, she mentions that this job is also very appealing for her, as the flexibility in hours is helping with her family situation, and the perks and benefits are definitely a plus. And my question to you, which I'm going to launch in the poll in a second, is does adding this information towards the end in the interview increases or decreases your enthusiasm about this candidate? So I'm going to launch the poll now. So I hope you can see the question on your screen. So if you can, please answer the question, and then I will share the results. I have 90% vote. Okay, so let me end the poll and share the results. Let's share the results now. So hopefully you can see the results on your screen. Most of you said does not change, and there's actually a split of increase versus decrease in terms of the enthusiasm about this candidate. So we will talk about this very issue in a second. And before I start and talk about the research project related, I want to tell you an actual example, and this is from littlethings.com from March 2017, talking about a woman is outraged after second job interview gets canceled just because she asked about salary. And if you Google, you can see the whole story, and I put some screenshots from this article. So basically, this person, Taylor, was asking the hiring manager, how much do you think I'll be getting paid an hour? Benefits would also be included. Sorry, I just thought I should ask now. Thanks for your time and have a lovely day. And to her amazement, the response that she got was, your questions revealed that your priorities are not in sync with those at Skip the Dishes is the name of the company. At this time, we will not be following through with our meeting this Thursday, which was supposed to be her second interview. And when she inquired a little bit more, she actually got a very elaborate response saying that as a startup company, they believe in hard work and perseverance, and someone who looks for challenges and opportunities. And they say it's paramount that our staff display intrinsic motivation and are proven as self-starters. So obviously, this hiring manager, when this person asked about those other features of the job, took it as going back to my poll, took it as an example or as a illustration that this person is less interested in the job itself. And this, I find it a bit a stunning example, and this was actually nicely illustrates the idea that my collaborator Marco Pitessa and I had in this project, in which we thought that it might be actually not an incident. It might be that in many cases, when candidates ask about things like salary, compensation, perks, flexibility, it's been taken as immediately a sign that says that they're actually less intrinsically motivated. And just in terms of definition, and to be honest, the research has actually progressed then, and it's not, people talk now more about controlled versus autonomous motivation. But the really one that was going back then, and many people do acknowledge, and even this recruiter actually talked about in this example, is the differentiation between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation will be everything around the core task itself, challenge, learning opportunities, and extrinsic motivation will be around anything that is around the task. So salary, benefit, maybe flexibility in time, location, and so forth. And if you think about this, when a candidate expressed interest in intrinsic and extrinsic features of the job, it would actually should give us more information about a fit. So if I am happy about the job, I'm excited about the job, but I also find the flexibility very appealing, other things around the job, it should actually give more information to the recruiter, potentially even signals that there is higher intention to accept the job, that it kind of fits my overall goal in life. And rationally, given a certain level of intrinsic motivation, especially if this is already high, information about extrinsic should give more evidence for recruiters. And in fact, if you look at the science itself, at research, and especially research across a few last years, and especially at the workplace, there is a lot of evidence that financial incentives are positively related to performance. They do not reduce intrinsic motivation, and in general, are actually more effective than we previously thought. So there is a synergy between intrinsic and extrinsic working together, as opposed to extrinsic eating up on intrinsic. However, our prediction was again in line with the example I gave before, is that unfortunately, in many cases, hiring managers might interpret those expression of intrinsic motivation as showing a reduced intrinsic motivation, and they might expect this pure intrinsic motivation, which is why we call it motivation purity bias. And why this might be the case, we actually think that we thought that this actually goes back to maybe even some of the fault that we have in the literature, and maybe some of the practice not being outdated with the literature. So if you go back to this scholar McGregor from 1960, he was talking about theory X and Y, employees that are kind of X that need a lot of monitoring versus employees that are kind of Y that are very intrinsically motivated and do not need a lot of monitoring. And it was more kind of an either or. And even the scales that were used in those studies were kind of illustrating this either or approach. Even in some of the books that we still learn, there are sentences like, if a person is motivated by status, money, and other goals, they might be less likely to achieve them and less happy with them. So it's more as if this means that they're not motivated by other stuff as well. And also generally, we know from social psychology literature that people have this overly simplified view of how other people's minds work. So when I think about myself, I think about myself as a complex person that can be motivated by different motivations. When I think about other people, I usually tend to simplify it. I usually tend to think about them as either or. People actually have those reduced, they think about other people's mental models as being less complex. When they think about other people's voting behavior, for example, they think that they only vote because they like a specific candidate, as opposed to taking the whole picture of also thinking about other candidates, as opposed to how they think about themselves. And again, the thing is that going also back to the literature that we had, there was some evidence that was talking about the motivation crowding out effect. This very, maybe you know this experiment in which people came to the lab, solved some problems for 3 days, and in the experimental group, on the second day, they were being paid for performance, and this payment was withdrawn on the third day. And on the third day, those people reported less satisfaction with doing the task itself after the incentives were reduced. And this was taken as a evidence that incentives actually erode intrinsic motivation. But if you think about this, this was a very, in a way, artificial, a little bit in the lab, that people were coming, doing stuff on their free time, as opposed to work, in which we all, if we admit it, also do in order to earn a living. So it was, and again, as I showed before, the evidence from the workplace seems to be that those should be in synergy, rather than how we show that people perceive it as extrinsic eating up on intrinsic. So we wanted to check and check our prediction and see whether this is, again, how people think about this. And we did few studies. I'll present quickly 2 of them. In one study, we took a group of students, our undergrad students that are doing research for credit. And those were students that were close to graduation, were kind of preparing for the job market. We asked them to think about a desired job that we have in a specific field, and based on the answer, they were redirected to a screen that showed them a job ad for a specific position that had all the requirements and so forth, and also had a section about the benefits and the salary and so forth. And we asked those students to imagine that they want to get this job and to write a cover letter to the company explaining why they're interested in this job, why they think they're a good fit, and what do they think about what the job offers and so forth. So we took all those cover letters that those students wrote, and we took a second group of people, of course, non-overlap sample, and we made them be the coders of those cover letters. So those coders actually saw 3 to 5 cover letters, and they either coded them on extrinsic motivation. We gave them the definition of this, of expression or signals that one is interested in extrinsic features of the job, or they coded them or intrinsic motivation. So they didn't do both. We didn't want them to think about it, so they either or, so they did either that or that. And we told them to just objectively mark the extent to which this person talks about extrinsic versus intrinsic features of the job. So we have a baseline of those more objective level of motivation. And then we took a third group of people, and they were playing the hiring managers. So those people were also exposed to 3 to 5 letters in a random manner. And they had, this time, they had to rate them on both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And we told them to rate those based on what they think the motivation is, as opposed to objectively what was expressed, like with the coders. And then we asked them to rate this candidate and to decide whether they would hire this candidate or not on a binary choice. And then what we did is basically we looked at the relationship between the objective expressed extrinsic motivation and perceived intrinsic, and how this leads to hiring decisions. And what we found is that cover letters that were coded objectively higher on extrinsic motivation were also rated by the hiring manager as lower on intrinsic motivation, regardless, or controlling for the actual intrinsic motivation that was in the cover letter. And then those reduced perception of intrinsic motivation led to 19% less likelihood to hire, to signal, to report that they are likely to hire this person. So this was one of the studies. And then we wanted to see, we thought, okay, those were students. Would this apply also to hiring managers who make hiring decisions on a regular basis? So we went and did another study in which we recruited hiring managers through a crowdsourcing company that recruits managers for us. And we asked to have managers who have at least 3 direct reports and who make hiring decisions on a daily basis. And we recruited those managers, and we actually did not tell them. So we got a permission from the IRB committee not to tell them that we are University of Maryland. We actually disguised ourselves as a small startup professional services company who is trying to validate their screening processes and to get some subject expert about, how people look at interviews, so we can improve our screening procedure. So to make it a bit more consequential and less hypothetical for them. Sorry. And what we did is that we took a professional actor, and this was actually someone at the drama school from UMD, and this is me interviewing him. And we created those different videos, business simulation, in which we interviewed this alleged candidate for a job. And we created 4 different versions, varying the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation that they expressed. So the videos were all the same. And also the cover letter and the CVs that our hiring managers got were all the same. But the difference between the conditions was in the answer that this candidate, this actor here, gave to a question that I asked him, please tell me, why are you motivated to take this job in our company? Which is a question that is frequently being asked when someone is being interviewed for a job. And again, we varied what he answered. So in one condition, for example, on the left-hand side here, he talked a lot about intrinsic motivation, how they're so excited about the job itself and the learning and growth opportunities. And then he also talked a little bit just saying that he's quite happy with the package being offered. On the other hand, in the other condition on the right-hand side, he also talked to the same extent about intrinsic motivation, why they are happy and excited about the job itself, but he also added information about why this actually fits overall in his overall in life and how he actually appreciates the benefits and perks and so forth. And I want to emphasize what we did here, and this is across the whole project. We didn't create a situation in which the candidate is actually asking, demanding for more extrinsic. In fact, we even controlled in our analysis for perceived demands in the future. It was just saying that one is actually happy and find this attractive. And so those were the different conditions here. Those are the one, and we wanted to see how this relates to the perceived intrinsic motivation rated by those real hiring managers and to their decision to hire this person. And what we find here as well is that when people saw a video clip of this person showing high level of extrinsic motivation, even if he showed high level of intrinsic motivation as well, this led to reduced perception of intrinsic motivation, which led to 23% lower likelihood to say that they would hire this person. So this also replicated across with this hiring manager. So I didn't tell you the end of what happened with Taylor from the beginning. So fortunately for Taylor, one of the co-founders of this firm actually reached out to her, apologized, and said that this does not reflect the values of this company, and followed up with an apology and second interview. So this was fortunately for her. But I would argue that many people might not be as courageous as Taylor to actually, publicize the story, talk about it. Maybe sometimes they won't even know that this might be a reason that the other person didn't call them, the hiring managers, for another interview. So I do think that there are really important implications here for practice. This is clearly inefficient for organizations that are probably missing out on many qualified people that are actually high on both extrinsic and intrinsic, as the evidence shows. And maybe organizations need to celebrate those people and make sure that it's clear that those can actually act together. It also implications for gender inequality. In many cases, women are still taking a lot of responsibility of childcare, especially in early infancy. And they might care more about things like flexibility, maybe maternity leave. And in fact, teaching negotiations at Smith, I've had a lot of female MBAs throughout the years asking me about how they should approach getting information even about maternity leave, which they sometimes don't even get from the company. So this is a bit sad if this ends up actually firing back in terms of in exchange, instead of being appreciated for trying to find whether they're actually a good fit, they're actually being discriminated again. And it also has implications for discrimination again, protected group, people from lower maybe social economic status, people who might actually extrinsic is actually a necessity rather than a luxury for them, and they might actually care more about those things, rightfully so. And what a loss it is to society if we actually end up not hiring those who actually need the job the most. And there might also be policy implications here, right? So we can think maybe we should require companies to advertise some of the benefits instead of making the candidates ask about those. And finally, also goes to what I said in the beginning about how we came up with those predictions as well, maybe the science practice gap, because yes, there has been a lot of evidence back then about the motivation crowding out effect, but the science has actually updated, especially at the workplace, showing that extrinsic and intrinsic motivation act in synergy. But it might be that the practice or the lay people minds have not updated. So we need to make sure that we do that. And we need to make sure that we change this perception of those extrinsic eating up on intrinsic to that perception of extrinsic going hand in hand with intrinsic. So this was the first, so this is again, this zero sum, this extrinsic, intrinsic, it's either extrinsic or intrinsic, they're eating up on each other. I want to move to the second project, and I want to actually launch the second poll. And if you please answer this question. Oh, sorry, let me stop sharing this. And go to the second one. So I'm launching the second question, which is asking you, would you expect people who are financially strapped compared to those less financially strapped to be creative in finding a way to gain more financially? Yes, no, or maybe. All right, so let me end. We have 84% voted. Let me also share the results. So you can see the majority said no, which is actually what you'll see. I will share the results here, but there were some people who said yes or maybe. So let me talk to you a little bit about another project that relates directly to this question. So I'm stopping sharing here. So you're probably, especially if you took a negotiation class or know about negotiation, know about the notion of a fixed pie bias or enlarging the pie. So in negotiation, it's really important if we want to get a good outcome or to reach a win-win situation, is to try to understand how we leverage on different preferences rather than thinking about the pie as something that is fixed. We try to enlarge it and get better for both of us. So the classical example here with the orange, probably you know the story about the two sisters fighting over an orange. And if they don't, if they think about the pie as a fixed, they would just split the orange in half and each one of them would get half. But if they think about it in a more integrative manner, trying to enlarge the pie, they will try to figure out why they need the orange. And maybe they will figure out that one of the sisters needs the inside to make a juice and the other one needs only the peel to make some candies. And then instead of splitting in half, they can actually peel the orange. One gets the inside, one gets the peel of the orange. So they both get actually more, right? So what we wanted to look at this project is to look at the relationship between being financially vulnerable, coming from a lower social economic status, and those mindset of a zero sum in negotiation and how it relates to enlarging the pie in negotiation. And our prediction was that financial vulnerability would be related to a more zero sum mindset, a more win-lose situation as opposed to a win-win. And the reason we had this prediction was related to what's called in theory sampling-based belief formation. So we know that there is economic segregation or neighborhood effect. So people, for example, from lower social economic status might actually live usually in neighborhoods in which they are surrounded by others who are also from lower social economic status. In the work domain, if you are more entry level or you're doing work that is, on the more like production line, or you are less likely to be exposed to other, instances of wealth generation, of enlarging, of creating wealth from nothing and enlarging the pie. And introspectively, people who are financially strapped might be using more time to worry about finances. And so they might be less exposed to notions of if we can grow. And they might anchor from the self to the world and might have this belief that if one gains, the other one loses, as opposed to we can both lose. So they are less exposed to this wealth generation. And wealth generation. And there is actually evidence also from anthropology. This is the vulnerable peasants and the image of limited goods, and even evidence from psychology of financial markets. Those researchers who show that people who are financially vulnerable do not tend to think about the stock market as a way that you can actually grow more. So this was our prediction that those will be either manipulated to think that they are more financially vulnerable, or maybe come from a more low social economic status, will be more likely to think about the world as a zero-sum winner-losers, and as a result, might be less able to leverage on the integrative part of the negotiation and actually create more value also for themselves and others. And we find some first evidence from this from the World Value Surveys, in which this is around 200,000 participants, from around 90 countries across 25 years. And the World Value Survey has this question in the survey that asks people actually about zero-sum control of success. And 10 would mean people can only get rich at the expense of others. So this would be a zero-sum mindset. And 1 would be wealth can grow, so there is enough for everyone. So this would be a lower zero-sum mindset. And we took the answer to this question and regressed them on those markers of financial vulnerability. So which related to household income. We had different markers for this: household income, satisfaction with financial situation, period in which gone without cash, gone without food. It's actually, here it's a bit confusing because the x-axis is actually higher. It means lower financial vulnerability. So if you look here at the side where it's higher financial vulnerability, you can actually see that there was higher values of a zero-sum mindset. And so you can see the very clear here negative correlation. So this was from the World Value Survey, and that we wanted to go to the lab and see first, does it replicate in the lab in this results for zero-sum mindset that actually result in less value in a negotiation. So we did a study in which we brought students to the lab, and we manipulated financial vulnerability. So for half of the students, we told them, please reflect on your financial situation, why your financial situation is good or not good. In the other group, you could reflect on things that you're fortunately able or unfortunately not able to afford, or similar other specifics, positive or negative aspects of your financial situation. So you basically prime them to think about themselves as being financially vulnerable or not. So we brought about 170 participants to the lab. So there were 25 dyads negotiating, and we put people in the same mindset to negotiate together. So there were either 2 of them were under the condition in which they were primed to think about themselves as financially vulnerable, and the other half, both of them negotiating together, were primed to think about themselves as not being financially vulnerable. So they were going through this manipulation, and then they started the negotiation, and we introduced them with what we call an integrative negotiation. So there are different aspects, issues for this negotiation, and 2 of them are what we call integrative. So they both looked at them with different preferences. And so in parentheses, you can see what they got as a payoff metrics for the negotiation, what they care about and what they would get from the negotiation. And they should figure out that for the buyer, for example, warranty is more important. They get a lot of points if they get the best warranty, while for the seller, the delivery was more important. And if they manage to ask the question, think about it as a more, again, win-win, they will manage to make this trade-off and get better outcome for both of them. So higher points from the negotiation for both of them. And what we find, we actually had both conditions in which we had no financial incentive. So they just negotiated, but they didn't get anything out of this. And there was condition in which they actually, the best performing negotiation diet actually would win $50. So we actually got the results only when we actually presented incentives. And from then on, we actually did all the experiments with the incentives, and which makes sense also theoretically for us. But again, we wanted, in the initial experiment, we had both conditions. And we find, this is the white bar here, those who were low on financial vulnerability managed to create more value compared to those who were high of financial vulnerability. So this was one of the studies. And then we did another study in which we looked at, rather than manipulating this, we looked at people as social economic status. So we basically, again, brought students to the lab. But before they came to the lab, we actually asked them on a pre-survey to report household income. And we got these results, and we divided the household income by the number of people in the household to get a proxy for income level or financial vulnerability. And then we ranked them and we put them together when they came to the lab, such that they were, again, either negotiating with someone who was the same, more or less the same as them, high income or lower income. And again, they did the same exercise as I described before with the integrative negotiation, and we got a similar result. So you can see here the regression plot. So the higher income, the more they were likely to actually generate value. And with coming from lower household income, they were less able to create this value for both people in the negotiation. And why is this important in terms of implication from practice? We think that this has important implication for social and organizational training to overcome this generalized zero-sum control of success. So there has been studies showing that as opposed to business training, actually training to take initiative is more likely to help people or come from more lower social economic status in order to make them advance at the workplace. So maybe there's also value in thinking about this intervention as well, and encouraging people for this, reducing this zero-sum control of success. And maybe when managers negotiate with employees, when you managers negotiate with employees, and especially when it's entry level, maybe they are more financially vulnerable, consider sharing more information, initiating trust, promoting integrative problem solving, and showing, actually kind of pulling the other person from maybe a zero-sum mindset and role modeling this integrative mindset. And finally, create more opportunities for sampling from different situations, so reduce segregation. Maybe we can not do it in the neighborhood, but we can do it at the workplace, and we can create more horizontal, and people kind of go and sample different and visit other departments and see more opportunities for seeing how wealth can be generated to kind of break this zero-sum mindset. So again, we can move from to have this win-win as opposed to a win-lose. There are some winners and some losers. And finally, going to the last project that I want to present today, I'm actually going to launch the final poll. If you can please answer this final question on the poll, number 3 here. And the question here is, are ethical employees likely to be less creative at work? All right, so we have 73% vote, and I'm going to share the result. So most of you said no. So maybe what I will show here will surprise you. But as in everything in psychology, it depends. You will see that it does depend. So let me share a little bit from this. And again, this will be another, in a way, tension or zero sum of ethics and morality. Sorry, let me go here. So there actually has been research, and this is not by us, this is by Francesca Gino from Harvard and Scott Wiltermuth from University of South Carolina. And they have been looking at the relationship between this honesty and creativity. And actually, initially, they show the connection that people were more creative, sometimes are actually also more dishonest. And then in another paper from 2014, they show the other way around. They show that people who are, they were given the opportunity to cheat in the lab, to be dishonest also later on showed greater creativity. And the underlying theme here for the theoretical explanation for this here was that there is some common basis for ethics and creativity, here it's dishonesty and creativity. So a dishonesty sometimes is, and by definition, breaking the rule, breaking the societal rule. And because creativity is sometimes, thinking outside of the box, maybe not thinking about and not being about what is the status quo, this outside of the box is sometimes, again, there's this unconstrained by the rules common theme for dishonesty and creativity. And we looked at those studies, and then we thought, so does this mean that people who are more honest might by predisposition are actually more moral people and care about morality? Does it mean that those people will be less creative? And if this is the case, of course, this is a problem. We actually want to encourage ethical employees being ethical. And if it is the case, how do we resolve this? So we looked at what we call moral ownership. So we actually measured those people's moral ownership, and moral ownership is defined as a sense of responsibility over the ethical nature of their actions, those of others around them, and the organization. So those people who are high on moral ownership, they care about being ethical. They also care about the environment being ethical, and it really bothers them. And this is, again, something that we want to promote at the workplace, that other people are not ethical. And again, because, as I said before, because there is this positive negative connotation in the domain of creativity, this self-constraint, they might actually not be able to think out of the box. And actually, not just that, they might also have the moral burden to actually enforce morality, which might deplete them deplete their energy from actually being engaged in other outward role, like being more creative, because there is limits to how much we can go above and beyond our role. So we thought this might be the case, but we also thought, again, we want to think how we can resolve this if this is the case. And what we predicted is that we want to think about ethical leadership. So we thought that when there is a leader who is very ethical, when there's the leader who is actually take the role of enforcing and of first defining what is actually, when it's okay in a way to think outside of the box, but when it's actually not okay to break the rules, and also enforces it on other people. So it takes the burden of those people who are high on moral ownership. This might allow those people to actually, maintain their ethicality and their moral ownership while also being more creative. So this is the question that we aimed and we wanted to resolve in this research project. And in the first study, we had people, real employees. We recruited them through, again, a crowdsourced company called ROI Rocket, and they actually recruited dyads for us, employee and managers. And we measured those employees, again, predisposition, moral ownership on a scale. And we also asked those employees to rate their leader on ethical leadership. And we asked the leader to rate those employees on how creative they are. So it is not self-report, just subjective evaluation of the employee. It's actually objective evaluation of the leader. And what we find here, this is the first study, this was actually done here in the US. So first you can see that there is overall trend, employees who are high on moral ownership rated as less creative. However, and this is the really most important result here, is this was actually happening with a low ethical leadership. So this is the solid line here. But when there was a leader who was high in ethical leadership, they were actually mitigating. So this slope is not significant. So when there was a high ethical leader, there was no relationship between moral ownership and creativity. And then we replicated these results also, and this was a team-based study in China with 63 bank branches. And again, we had those employees rating leaders' creativity, the leader rating leadership, ethical leadership, the leader rating employees' creativity. And we also asked the leader to rate the actual annual performance, not creativity, of the employees, to make sure that this is something specific to creativity and not generally maybe leaders that are ethical just like this person more, and this is why they rate them higher on everything, to make sure this, again, very relevant to creativity. And we replicated the results again. Here it was less pronounced, but there was what we call a main effect. So those higher moral ownership were less rated as less creative. But again, there was a strong moderation of ethical leadership. So this was for the solid line here, was true for low ethical leadership, but with high ethical leadership, this relationship was mitigated. And finally, we wanted to do like a cool study in the lab as well, not just to kind of be more able to infer causality. So we did a study in the lab in which we brought people to play a game in the lab. So we told them they are going to be one of these avatars here, and they played a game in which they had to throw a ball to another participant, allegedly another participant, because it was all pre-programmed simulation with fake others, but they didn't know that. They actually came to the lab with different people and they didn't know that they're playing with computer. But they were actually playing this game with other people, and they had to throw the ball to another person. And once the person gets the ball, they have to come up with a usage of a paperclip. And the more they generate those usages of paperclip, the more they earn money for the team. So this was kind of what they had to do. But importantly, what we did here is that we manipulated we manipulate ethical leadership here. So, and sorry, I forgot to say, before they came to the lab, or actually when they came before they started the task, we also measured their moral ownership like we had before, across with other personality items, so to mask the purpose of this. And so when they came, there was allegedly a message from the leader saying, "Hi, I'm the leader, looking forward to working with you." Again, they didn't know this was not real. They thought there was someone who was being randomly assigned to be the leader. And then we had low unethical and high ethical leadership conditions. In the low and the unethical condition, the leader said, "Make sure you put answers so we get as many points as possible." In the high ethical leadership, the leader allegedly said, "Make sure you put only good and valid answers so we get good and legitimate points." Because they realized it later on, they could just put nonsense and still get points for the team. And then we manipulated one person coming to the team and saying, "Hey, we can earn more money by typing quickly this nonsense word." Allegedly someone from their team doing that. And then the leader responded. So either they didn't say anything, which was the low ethical leadership, or they actually said, "This is a good idea. We can earn as many points as possible using this way." Or they actually said, "Stop sending nonsense words. You're ruining it for the rest of the team." So this was the high leadership condition. And then after they finished the first task, we let them all do a creative task, which is called the remote association task, in which you have 3 words and you have to find some word in common. So you have to adopt from different domains in life. So it's a good proxy, an objective proxy for creativity. And what we find here, again, this is also revealing because we also had the low and unethical leadership. We see that in both the low and unethical leadership condition, those are those 2 lines, the negative slope, we see that employees who are higher on moral ownership were actually performing less well on the remote association test, on the creative task. But when there was a high ethical leadership, this is what actually the results became positive, and it was actually being able to mitigate this negative relationship. So again, so what we see here, it's not enough just not to be unethical. You actually have to be ethical and take action in order to allow someone who cares about morality to also be creative. And here implication for practice is that if ethical leadership matters even more than we thought. So not just for ethics, which of course is really important for organizations, but here also for task performance or creativity. And maybe there is a bit of a tension with creativity and morality. It can actually be effectively managed in organizations. And we do want to cultivate employees who are both moral and creative. So again, we want to make those people friends, ethics and creativity. So I'm going to end soon. It's just kind of a conclusion from everything. We have this tendency to oversimplify. We have the tendency to dichotomize, and the zero-sum mindset is largely detrimental. And we want to maybe take the step back, checking the assumption, being more open to live with alleged contradictions that can promote, and this can promote job motivation, economic outcomes, creativity, also authenticity, trust, and even dispute resolution, both at the workplace and also at the world, which really needs it. So we had a really difficult year. So, thinking about being more open to different contradictions and not immediately making conclusions about a person being either or might help us all. And just ending with this final slide and kind of final thought and invitation to try to make also research and practice go together. So I do invite you, and this is something that we always like, when we have people like you coming to us and ask, do you want to do a study with us? Maybe we can help you solve a problem that is helpful for you, and this can also be helping for us to solve and to accumulate knowledge, and even maybe reduce this sometimes science practice gap that I talked about. All right, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time. So I'm going to once again say thank you, Rellie, Dr. Derfler Rozin. Thank you so much for your preparation and your presentation today of this. It's fantastic. And thank you to all of the attendees who came and joined us for the day. We are recording this, we have recorded it, and we will include the slides along with it with Dr. Derfler Rozin's acceptance of that, and we will post them and send them out in an email to you. And we look forward to hosting more of these sessions. Mark, keep coming back in the future. We also have other webinars, short courses, and other learning opportunities from the Smith School of Business. Again, thank you from the Smith School Office of Executive Education, Alumni Relations, and Dr. Derfler Rozin. Thank you so much again. Please stay safe and go Terps.
Go Terps. Thank you.